Marshall. Thank you for joining me in this episode this week in the Spiritual Perspectives. I'm really honored to have you on. And I know we've been talking since last 3 to 4 months about doing this, but finally we made it. And thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Pari. And I know it's been a little time to get here, and I appreciate your patience and perseverance. I know we're both got a lot going on, and this is always so fun to dive into these conversations, and I can tell from your background that it's going to be a good, interesting, and stimulating journey through some of these topics. So
absolutely, yeah. I think it's it is so integrated. The science and spirituality are so integrated, and when we start really understanding with an open mind and look into these things, that's when we start understanding what is every religion or every spiritual teacher talking about.
Yeah,
it's really incredible.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and that's the beauty of what's, I believe, happening now with science, that is now being able to match what we understand intuitively and through direct spiritual experience, that the two are coming together. And I'm sure we'll explore some of that as we go into it today.
Right, absolutely. So I started reading your book, Cosmomety. The audience who is watching, you must get this book to really understand the science and really understanding the technical details about how everything is so integrated, so connected. I really enjoyed the read. I haven't honestly finished, but I can't wait to finish the book. And have so many questions on that today. And I believe there's a lot of details as well on cosmomety.com, where people can go check out about the book.
Yes, exactly right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Okay, so before we get started, Marshall, I really wanted to know about you. Like, what is your background? Where were you born? How did you grow up? What kind of environment did you grow up?
Yeah, great. I was born in Stamford, Connecticut, and on the East Coast where you are, in 1958. And so I was a young child of the 60s, and I have 3 older brothers, and they were old enough to be more into the current and stream of the 60s. But I remember like when the Beatles were first on Ed Sullivan, watching that on TV all together. So it was a very, obviously a very transformative time in at least American culture, but really ultimately around the world. It shifted a lot. And really in my early childhood, I think the relevant to this conversation, the most important thing that happened to me in my early childhood was my parents, one of my father's uncles had a cabin in northern New York State in the Adirondack Mountains. Very remote. It's 2 hours from where you leave the car, and you have to row a couple of lakes and hike a mile between the lakes to get to this cabin. And when you get there, it's just pristine, pure nature beauty, right in the high peaks of the Adirondacks. And so I first went there when I was 5 years old, and I'm still going there to this year. That's like 56 years later. I'm still going to that cabin, and it's one of the most amazing places to experience the magic of nature, that real connection we have, and to see how there's this interaction between ourselves and nature that's going on all the time. And it's helpful to be in a place like that where it's so pure, you can really tune in. And so that's been one of my greatest teachers. I say that in the book as well. That being in that environment there, I learned so much about what I've written about by being directly in relationship with nature and having some pretty magical experiences there. And so that was a very big influence for me. And then when I was 19 years old, I was in my first year of college, and I had what I call a frying pan over the head waking up experience one night. That was predicated by being in an extreme emotionally unstable place in myself, like a real total identity crisis, basically. And in the kind of the height of that, I had this realization, this thought just came into my mind. I was blaming all my frustrations and and anger on everything around me, the kids in the school and everything. And this thought came into my mind that I am creating the whole thing. I'm making it up. And as soon as that thought came in, it popped me into a different state of consciousness. It was really quite remarkable. And so I've been on a very alternative kind of a path of life ever since then, because I really started questioning everything at that point. And
how old were you at that point?
I was 19.
19. Okay.
Yeah, I was in 1978.
Okay.
And that same year, right after that, I had three very important things happen. I studied Aikido for the first time, the martial art of Aikido, which is a beautiful art practice that is oriented towards harmonizing with the universe. It's not about fighting it. It's about blending and redirecting to neutralize it back into harmony. It's just fantastic principles, which I write about also in the book, that I think are just so important for anybody and everybody to understand, whether they practice the martial art or not. It also taught me about the torus field, and our dynamic relationship to it, and our one point in the belly, the dantian. And then I also took a course right after I had that experience of that awakening experience. And the first book assigned was Be Here Now by Ram Dass. And so that was very like, wow, this is very interesting. Something's going on here that's, new understanding of what I'm experiencing. And then the third thing is that summer I went back to my parents' house and I decided to read a book, and I found one in their library called Intuition by Buckminster Fuller. And it something kind of really drew me to it. And that book really transformed me, because it gave me a sense of a large perspective of what's going on with humanity and humanity's relationship to the earth and the universe, the way Buckminster Fuller can describe these things. And it also grounded me into a more pragmatic, I really dove into Buckminster Fuller's work at that point, in his books. And he actually came to my college the next year, and I got to meet him in 1979, which was a big, huge treat for me. And Bucky was an extremely cosmic thinker, like to the max. He would start with the whole universe and then work down, like get rid of things that weren't relevant to whatever his inquiry was. And so he always was looking at the whole big picture. And yet he was also extremely pragmatic and grounded. And so that set me on a path of having an inquiry into understanding the geometries, the dynamics of nature, the way nature is, you can see the patterns in nature from that more cosmic expanded state, as well as then always wanting to know what's real about it rather than what's cool about it. Because there's a lot of what's cool, the beauty of a lot of the sacred geometry designs and things like that. I've always been interested in what is it teaching us about physics, about science, about nature, about energy dynamics, and about ourselves. And Bucky was very pragmatic that way. And so I studied his work deeply, and I studied the patterns in nature that I was seeing up at the cabin and all throughout the world, really, in my own way. And then around 2000, 2001 or so, I met both Foster Gamble, who created the film Thrive, which came out in 2011, and I'm an associate producer of that film, and we're working on Thrive 2 right now, which is very exciting. And also Nassim Haramein, who is, I believe, really the most advanced physicist in the world in pioneering an understanding, a model of physics that is really congruent with both experience and also mathematically, he's solving all the major problems in physics with incredible accuracy based on his fundamental theory. So those two really became very strong, brothers and allies in my life, and have taught me so much. And a lot is reflected in my book about, especially Nassim's theory. It's really founded on his unified physics and then the cosmic geometry and then music, and how they're all one and the same. And I'm a musician as well. So
Yeah.
it's a little quick survey of my journey.
That's amazing. So I'm just wondering, like, when you were 19 years old and you had this experience, at that point there was no internet or not much of information available for you to even go research or things about. So how did you, did you talk to anybody? Did you discuss about this?
Well, the interesting thing is I didn't know what I know now, so I didn't know even what to talk about.
Right.
and I knew it was, well, it's spiritual and it's scientific, and I also knew that I wasn't going to find answers in my school or in a college. So I attempted to continue going to school, but I realized quickly that, boy, this is not going to be it for me.
Right.
And so I didn't finish through college, and I just went off on a journey that has been very very intuitively guided and very spontaneous in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Finding my way. I've never been really attracted to diving into any particular like spiritual or religious philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and in some ways some of the academic side of it as well, which, especially if I was to like, oh, I want to study physics, I would have learned so much about what is both correct, but also what's not correct, where they went off and they're teaching people things that are just very incorrect and confusing. So I sort of kept myself free of all those things, and in doing so was able to receive whatever was kind of emerging, and especially revealing through nature and my own inquiry. Yeah, and back in those days, it was, I knew I met many people that I could talk ideas with, talk about some of the things that I was becoming aware of, people interested in Buckminster Fuller's geometry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really when the internet came and the kinds of software and basically when computers became available in the early 90s, late
Right.
80s, early 90s. And from there on, that's when I could really start developing. As you know, in my book, there's a lot of visual material. And until I could actually create that material, I really couldn't tell this whole story.
Right.
And so it was quite an evolution to get to that point. But yeah.
That's wonderful. So in this journey of from that point until now, where you have this research, you have this evidence in front of you, and to write a book, did any of your belief systems that you had before, did they really get shattered? Like did what you believed at that point didn't make sense and you had to change it along? Did that happen? And how did you react? How did you take that?
Yeah, I would say my personal life's journey has been a continuous experience of questioning belief systems,
Mm-hmm.
mine and those that we see in the world.
Right.
And really quite early on, because when I looked into spiritual teachings, I've quickly realized they're all basically saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all within us.
Mm-hmm.
And the source is within, and to access and gain our sense of self through that inward accessing source.
Right.
And then we can see it reflected in the world around us. And so not that I was in any way an expert at doing that. I had to go through in my own personal journey, and a lot of my childhood imprinting and
Mm-hmm.
fears and things like that I had to really face in order to keep evolving in a direction that was, getting more and more free of those kinds of beliefs and opening to what is true in a larger sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an ongoing process, I think, for all of us.
Yeah.
And it can be sometimes very destabilizing and ultimately very affirming. So I've always embraced it from that perspective. And I also, I know I stopped watching TV probably 35, 40 years ago, when I just could see that was not serving
Yeah.
really understanding what is a true nature of reality, and then to see how the culture of the world expresses in the kind of systems that we create for economy or education or governments and all that, realizing that they're very contrived. And so what are the beliefs they're based on is really the fundamental question.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say in the introduction of the book, I believe that we're coming to understand now a more universal belief system, meaning more attuned to the way the universe works, not just something we made up, but actually seeing and understanding these patterns and understanding the science and how it relates to the consciousness that can really transform us as a whole at this time, if we choose to base our beliefs on that understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. I just asked this question because most of the people that I work with who are more coming from the left brain, who are, from the corporate background or anything, and we introduce this concept, one of the things we teach is have an open mind, and your beliefs, it's all, whenever our belief systems are being challenged, that's when people just go off into their shells and not really open to, as you did, like, you embraced it, and you move forward, and that opened up so many other new perspectives for you. So that's something that I just like, it's any scientist, like for you, I see you as a scientist, the musician, and you have this really amazing combination of creative and left brain and right brain energy coming together, and I think that's pretty amazing.
Thank you. Yeah.
And now talking about the first thing that we started off with, the holographic universe. Is, I mean, this is something that we hear everywhere, like you just mentioned, everything is just a reflection. So how, and you talk about that in the holographic perspective, like the whole and the integral fractal piece of it.
Yes, exactly.
So can you explain more about it, like how that really comes together?
Yeah, that's great. It's I love this inquiry because it actually, in order to fully understand it inside of ourselves, not just in our minds, but in our whole being, I believe it takes kind of switching on another function in our brain or in our mind to think holographically, because we're really raised to think linearly and cause and effect and space and time. And there's a direction of time, and takes from this, to get from here to there, it takes this much time. Information can only travel at the speed of light. So all these things have a true aspect to them in the classical physics, of course. And then there's a need to transcend that in order to start thinking holographically, where we could say all of the information, which can be light, sound, all the dynamics of the universe, that every aspect of it has a specific set of information, and that information is shared and present throughout the entirety of the whole. And so the simple definition I use in my book for the holographic idea here, the concept, is that the image or the information of the whole is present at every point. That's what's true with a hologram when they make a hologram image on a glass plate. That's what makes it different from a photograph, which photographs are basically kind of a one-to-one image like that. Well, a hologram captures the same point of information at every point on the plate. So every point of the object that's visible to the plate is captured at every point on the plate. So it's a distribution of the whole of the information to every point. And ultimately, it turns out, and that's what Nassim's physics is really showing, and also the holographic principle in the current physics model is showing that really, ultimately, the entire universe is entangled in that scientific sense, physics sense, is entangled and connected, and so that all the information of the whole is present at every point. And what's really beautiful about taking this to a greater understanding is that the field of light that we are in right now, that we are perceiving through our eyes, and really makes up such a large part of our identity of who we are, and that and light and sound are really so fundamental to our experience of ourselves and consciousness in the world. And the entire field of light and sound actually behaved exactly the same as the hologram, where the information of the whole is present at every point. And it actually makes it possible to have our perception work the way it does. If it were not that way, our perception would not work the way it does. There might be gaps in the field of light where the information of a certain part of it was not present. And if we were there, we wouldn't see that part. But that doesn't happen. And so really, it's fundamentally understanding that both light and sound, which really comprise our experiential perceptual reality most fundamentally. And visible light is just a small portion, of course, of the full electromagnetic spectrum. And so it goes way beyond what we can just see.
Right.
And that the whole thing behaves exactly the same as what we would call a classic hologram. And so, I am not even to say convinced, I am fully confident that we are in a fully and completely and wholly holographic and fractal universe here. There's no question.
And also I've read in many books and also seen that even Nassim talking about how we are all connected, we are all one, in the sense it is going deeper into our atomic level, into the way it works. So that is why we can say we are all connected because we are all connected at the atomic level.
Yeah, his theory is indicating that the protons that make up the nucleus of atoms, like you're saying at the atomic level, the protons, which, by the way, is very important to understand that protons, what they call particles in the particle physics and the quantum physics, protons are not known to decay. Like atoms and molecules and things like that, they'll decay and they'll break apart to their constituent pieces. But protons are basically eternal. The estimated half-life of a proton is 4 times the age of the universe. That's current, like maybe it's that. Wow. At a certain point, it doesn't matter. Obviously, protons are not decaying. And so they are really fundamental to the structure of the universe. Of course, they make up all the matter that we are. They make up 99% of the mass of the atoms. And so the matter and mass that we experience are pretty much based on protons with the electrons interacting around them. Right. And what Nassim's theory has, and his equations have shown, is that the content of information inside the volume of a proton, when you calculate it as little bits of information related to the Planck scale, which is vastly smaller than the size of a proton, 20 orders of magnitude smaller than a proton. When you calculate the little oscillating bits of information inside the volume of a proton, you get a value of 10 to the 55 grams of information energy density, basically energy density, right? Electromagnetic energy density. Well, 10 to the 55 is also the estimated mass of the universe as a whole. So the mass of all the protons out in the universe is equal to what he calls the holographic mass inside the volume of every proton, indicating that they're all entangled and they're all sharing information. So there's an equilibrium state between the external, universal, relative universe and the internal volume of every proton that's connected to every other proton, which is that holographic, information that's shared across all of them. And boy, when you start thinking about it that way, it just, wow, it just blows your mind.
Yeah, and I saw that it was mentioned in the book that you do not refer, proton as a solid, but say it as an electromagnetic energy, or the vibration to it, and having a torus field, which we'll talk in a bit about it.
Yeah. Hmm.
Because
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, really, there are no actual solid things.
mhm,
That's been, really understood in physics for quite some time. It's all vibratory states, and it's and in spinning, spiraling toroidal vortices of the field that makes up space and time. And that it's there's a gradient of the density of that field, and it's across that gradient that we experience the kinds of matter that we experience, the solid, seemingly solid surfaces of metal and wood and all that, and rocks, and then the fluid,
right,
water and air dynamics. And these are all basically fundamentally energy density gradients of the same material, which is both atomic and subatomic at the Planck
so
scale.
so all we are saying, like, say for this is a crystal rock.
Yeah.
So this, we are perceiving this as matter, but this is just atoms coming together and spinning in their vibration and holding that frequency together, and we
Yeah.
perceive it as solid. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And it really then relates to the geometry of how they come together.
Mm-hmm.
There's a crystal. The geometry of that crystal is very specific and very organized,
Correct.
and therefore very both compact and condensed,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty well held, bonded together in a very organized way that makes it very strong, hard to break that.
Correct.
Whereas the exact same atomic materials,
Mm-hmm.
atoms make up something like water, where it's very, the geometry is very mutable
Mm-hmm.
and fluid, as we would call it. But it's the same thing. So you're exactly right. It's that kind of a gradient, density gradient that makes the difference, and the geometries that make them up.
Right. And one of the things that I've heard with the crystals is that the crystals, and I read about the protons as well, that you've written about the entropy point, that they are not prone to entropy. They do not get into disorder as we do, as we all do. But that's the interesting part of the proton, that they do not get. But my question is, if they do not, we are made up of protons, is that quality of proton not affecting us?
Yeah, well, it is actually, and we're affecting not the protons as much as the atomic and molecular aspects of the make up our being, our
Mm-hmm.
body. And and this bridges into the relationship to consciousness then,
Mm-hmm.
which you really, the other thing, when you start thinking holographically or holofractally, including that fractal scaling aspect, but especially holographically, it starts to get to the point where you realize that there's really only one thing going on, and it looks like lots of different things.
Right.
But there's only one thing going on. And so ultimately then the material physical universe and the consciousness or metaphysical universe are one and the same thing. And ultimately, I believe, how could it be otherwise, really? We get our perception, is kind of fools us into thinking, and a lot of our education and the science that we've been taught
Mm-hmm.
leads us to believe that it's otherwise.
Right.
And of course, Rene Descartes started that by making the dualism of mind and matter, and they're not one and the same. But in fact, that's, I don't believe, true at all. And even the physicist David Bohm really felt like, consciousness and matter had to be one and the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so how that then relates to our personal experience in our bodies, our thoughts and feelings that we experience as consciousness are directly relating both to the matter, the atoms and the protons that make up our cells,
Mm-hmm.
as well as then when you think about then the protons being the interface between the universal field that's underlying that, from which they're getting their energy, and from which they are connected, through which they're connected to everything else, this unified field, that they're exchanging information about the totality of the universe through themselves, and then that's expressed into our bodies, because the surface of the protons are what we call the local mass, or the local hologram. That's like the part of the whole that is expressed locally. It's like an interface between the universal and the local. And so we have this localized collection of all this atomic information exchange going on that's connected fully into the universal field. And so that interface between the two is very much affected by how we think, our thoughts, our beliefs, how we can open to the universality or limit ourselves in our understanding and beliefs, and also then, of course, by what we feel, what we say, what we eat, how we act. All these things are interacting with that fundamental underlying information exchange. And so it's very integrally related in that regard. And there's so much we could go into on that.
Right. Absolutely. That's pretty fascinating. I mean, and again, that's just the first chapter in the book. There's so much more. But I wanted to touch base on the perceptions, about how we say our perception is what creating our reality in the metaphysical world. And also I read that perception only works because reality is holographic. That was the line from here.
Yeah.
And another one which caught my attention was the angle of incidence equal to the angle of perception. So I wanted to know, just understand that piece of it, like how perceptions are really working, creating our realities.
Well, from the first of all, from the physics side of it, from what you just those points you just highlighted, as I was saying before, the field of light has to work holographically in order for it to work the way it does. So our perceptions only work the way they do because the entire structure is based on that holographic phenomenon. And if it weren't, then it just wouldn't work properly from a very practical perspective of information being missing, as I was saying before. And so that, I think, really is extremely informative of what is our true underlying nature, and on what are we basing our perception of this reality. And so if that's the case, well, that makes it possible to visually see everything the way that we do. Wherever we look, we can see the whole of the image around us. Wherever we place our eye, that whole image is there. And then what you said about the angle of incidence equals the angle of perception. It's just like when you take a holographic image, which you may be familiar with, and it's a flat surface, and you can see a three-dimensional object and look around different sides of it. That's like changing the angle of incidence and having a different perception of that object. And that's exactly what's happening here. Whenever we move our eyes to a new location, we're changing our angle of incidence into the hologram, looking in the hologram from a different perspective. Now, metaphysically, I would say, there's two things that relate to this, which is that, first of all, understanding that the entire field of not just light and sound, but consciousness as well, is what I call hologramic. Holographic being the visual side of it, and holosonic being the audible, the sound side of it. And so hologrammic is about the information of all of that is present at every point, all the time, throughout the entire universe. It just seems so vast. How could it be so? But when you start to base your understanding on that, it it opens up perception of reality that is, you could say basically all inclusive. You realize, whoa, it's all one thing. I am that one thing, and I am directly participating in the co-creative relationship of the emerging larger sense of that one thing, or my perception of it, and that perception of myself within it. And it really helps to then integrate oneself into a sense of the presence of oneself as, I don't even want to say as part of something larger. It's actually as something, it's really being that whole, it's really being a cosmic being as well as being a human being at the same time. And then I feel like that is such a key perceptual shift that will enable we humans to really make the shift we need to make in the world, to understand, wow, we think it's all like these separate things, and we struggle and we fight and we have these perceptions that are based on something that's actually not true. And when you understand the underlying fundamental nature, this hologramic wholeness, and that we are that, it informs your relationship with yourself and the world in a new and really more essential way, I feel. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. That's really giving a very visual. When you talked about the hologram and explained that example, it was very visual, and it made more sense.
Great.
So the next thing I wanted to talk about, move into, is the Taurus. So I have been studying with the Heart Math Institute, and I probably by the video comes out, I will be certified as a trainer there. And one of the most important piece that the whole concept is based on is coherence, is how we have coherence with our heart and mind. And also they teach about the Taurus around us, which is magnetic energy that carries information of our emotions and feelings with it. And when we are in coherence, the Taurus around us, the magnetic energy influences environment and people around us. So, and you have mentioned a lot about the Taurus. So I just wanted to know what exactly that is, and it defined as a form of energy that takes in a coherent and stable state. So just wanted to understand, is that what we are referring to? Is that what is Taurus and how is it affecting us?
So yeah, a Taurus, for those who are not familiar with that term yet, it's spelled T-O-R-U-S, Taurus. It's mathematically or topologically, it's what they call a continuous surface that's that has a hole in the middle and wraps around itself, and it's often described as being donut-like. And I actually think the only thing that's donut-like about a Taurus is a donut. So, but because a Taurus is actually not a static object, it's a dynamic flow process that's recirculating around, and it's like that circular shape with the hole in the middle, and it's involuting and evoluting. And so it's a dynamic of energy, motion, and action that is found at all scales throughout the entire universe, and is understood then to be the form, you could say, that energy takes when it comes into a stable and coherent reciprocating dynamic. And really, in order for anything to be stable and coherent, it needs to be in an ongoing manner. It needs to have a continuous feedback loop that is reinforcing itself, recreating itself, and also doing so in relationship to its environment. And the other thing that's important to understand about the Taurus is that in the energy dynamics of the cosmos,
Mm-hmm.
A torus is not it, or a torus is made from the medium in which it exists. So if you imagine a smoke ring, somebody blows a smoke ring, you
Mm-hmm.
see this rolling, circular, beautiful, that's a torus. Now
Mm-hmm.
the torus isn't some object there. It's something we see that's an emotion dynamic. And you can see it because there's smoke. You could blow a ring with your mouth just the same with air, but you don't see it, but you're still making a torus. But when you add smoke in, now you can see it. And so it's made from the medium in which it exists, meaning it can be air, it can be water, it can be electromagnetic or magnetic fields are toroidal, the magnetic field around the Earth and the sun, the whole galaxy has what's called a dual torus system, where you actually have two tori stacked together.
Mm-hmm.
And the plane that they meet in between them is where the galaxy appears. And it's known that there are these halos of stars around the galaxies that are wrapping up and coming back around and making a double toroidal pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really the fundamental energy dynamic that is when energy comes into coherence, and you're relating it to heart math,
Mm-hmm.
and the heart's coherent state, and even the brain's coherent state, is directly tied into how we can be in relationship with our own toroidal field, and to actually be conscious of it and come into a, like some of the practices that you're soon to be certified to teach and share through heart math are specifically to engender that kind of coherence. And literally, our torus is made of the energy of our hearts, the magnetic field of our heart. And there's another one around our brain and around our whole body. And the chakras, I believe, are all torus fields.
Mm-hmm.
And how we engender coherence or not,
Right.
influences or informs our experience emotionally, mentally, physically. So it's very important to have that awareness and to use the kind of tools that you're working with. I appreciate you doing that.
I'm very excited. This really fascinates me because coming from India, I learn a lot about the theoretical part of it, the spiritual side of it, but really coming and understanding how, all the work that you are doing and bringing that, connecting that fascinates me. And that's something that I teach and I work with all my clients is bringing this, information from the East and marrying it with the science is pretty fascinating. And it gives us confidence as well in the work that we are doing, which is the byproduct of it, of understanding both. So
it really does. It's so important that our minds understand what our hearts and intuition, our like feeling experience knows spiritually.
right.
We know that to be true, but our minds are like, but I don't understand it. But now we're getting a science that helps the mind, or enables the mind to understand it.
Right.
And when the mind understands it, it can finally relax.
Yes.
Because until the mind is understanding something, it's confused and concerned and fearful and all that stuff. But when understanding comes in, it integrates with the experience.
Right.
And that's such a big shift. And I just appreciate how much you're also looking how to marry the science from the West with the spiritual deep roots from the East.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to see how the spiritual people are, who, if we do not bring in science, we know the theoretical part of it, but as you said, we really don't know, we don't see when there's a skeptic coming and asking questions. And they are very, it goes both ways. I feel like the open-mindedness should go both to the science, the skeptics, and as well as to the spiritual people, accepting new belief systems, accepting new theories. And that's where having the scientific